Now, Anne, I do want to start with you because you've written this piece in Maclean's magazine entitled "Alabama is Closer Than We Think" when we're talking about this particular issue. What did you mean by that? Elaborate.
Well, I think I want to preface that the title with the fact that we are not going to see a full, sort of abortion ban in this country. The point of the piece was actually built upon other work that I've done, investigative work into the anti-abortion lobby and its, growing militancy and engagement with the political process. So what I'm looking at is the things that we are seeing a shift in the cultural attitude toward abortion. We're seeing a new sort of platform being put forth by these groups. We've already seen the election of 2 majority conservative governments that were aided by these groups quite actively. So that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the fact that 10 years ago we would have never imagined that Roe versus Wade would be challenged in the way it is being now. And my point is simply that we cannot be complacent and that we have to be watching all of the signs that are out there about this shift in attitude.
Brittany, do you think that there is some support for that? And I guess, Anne, you're referencing there Ontario and Alberta, where we've seen new leaders come in with the support of some of these lobby groups.
I absolutely agree with Anne. One thing that this past week has shown us is that women's rights, and more specifically a woman's right to access reproductive health care, is something that we cannot take for granted. It's something that's not ingrained. It's something that's not set in stone in terms of our access to reproductive health care. And I think absolutely that whenever that's the case, that Canada is not immune to that. So Anne mentioned the election of 2 majority governments, and she was referring to Ford and Kenney, and they were aided by the social conservative fraction and movement within their individual provinces. Specifically within the Alberta context, Jason Kenney is directly linked to a number of anti-abortion groups. He has also appointed anti-abortion supporters and spokespeople in his cabinet. So these are things we need to look at very carefully when we're assessing how close this threat is. So I definitely do think that Canada is not immune to this movement that is rising in the States. And I think absolutely people need to be on guard in regards to the protection of women's rights. And it's never too soon to start advocating or even to put that on the political agenda to ensure that women's rights ensure that women's rights remain prevalent.
And I imagine few would question the fact that when it comes to the political climate in the U.S., that is something that we are seeing somewhat reflected here in Canada too. So Sean, I wanted you to weigh in on that as well, about whether or not this could be an issue that we also see sort of move into Canada.
Well, there's some of what I've heard so far I agree with. We aren't immune to the perspective amongst the Canadian populace that the current legal status quo with respect to abortion is problematic. Anne's column that she discussed earlier cites an Ipsos poll that shows, the majority of Canadians support abortion rights. Roughly half have misgivings of a legal framework that enables women to obtain abortions whenever they want. And so I think it's absolutely correct that there is a share of the population that has misgivings and with the status quo, and these people are participating in the political process. And I see nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think it's healthy. The other thing I would say, Brittany said that the status quo isn't entrenched. That's also correct. As you said at the outset, the Morgentaler decision determined that the legal framework predating that decision was unconstitutional. It didn't say that the legal status quo is the only charter-compliant legal framework. And so, I think it's highly unlikely that we'll see any politicians advancing, revisiting a plan to revisit the legal status quo. I think it's absolutely the case that there is a significant share of the population who believes that this is problematic and that it ought to be the subject of political debate. And as I said, I think that's healthy and shouldn't be precluded. It's not something to stand guard on. It's something to engage.
But one thing that is unhealthy about the current debate that's happening in the U.S. is that it is largely being led by men. Men who are inserting themselves into a conversation that has very little or actually nothing to do with their livelihoods, their bodies, their health, how it impacts their experience in regards to the process of pregnancy. So that is actually a very unhealthy component to this debate that's manifesting in the United States. It's that it's being led by men who are inserting themselves into the conversation around women's autonomy. There's a power imbalance here severely. Many women's voices have been silenced from this conversation. Men who are lawmakers are actually citing incorrect facts or speaking as if they're experts on women's bodies and how certain, whether it's morning after pills, a variety of different birth control measures, they're speaking as if they're an expert on this particular topic. So I do think that's a very unhealthy component in regards to women's equality and who is credible to speak on this particular issue.
Yeah, the only thing I would say to that is that, of course, the governor of Alabama is a woman, and polling for some time shows in the U.S. That views on issues of life, views on the question of abortion, are fairly equal across genders. And so I'm not familiar with the composition of the state houses in some of these states that are moving forward with legislation, but I think it is fair to say that there's less of a gender divide on this issue than sometimes people think.
And when we talk about the politics of it, and Anne, I'm going to go to you first next because I know our other panelists had a chance to have their piece. We were discussing about how this is being discussed by politicians as well. And we know that, for example, our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau yesterday expressed his disappointment with the Alabama ruling and reaffirmed his government's commitment to abortion rights and sort of took a shot at pro-life conservatives. So let's quickly take a listen to what he had to say.
Obviously, we are deeply disappointed by the backsliding on women's rights that we're seeing in some places around the world, including in some American states. As a government, as Canadians, we will always be unequivocal about defending women's right to choose, defending women's rights in general. It's a shame that we increasingly see conservative governments and conservative politicians taking away rights that have been hard fought over many, many years by generations of women and male allies.
And now also, just hours after the Prime Minister made that statement, the Liberal Party of Canada accused some Conservative MPs of trying to reopen the debate on abortion by speaking at anti-choice events. So, Anne, I want to go to you on this. Do you think it is fair to make these comments? Is it just all political positioning here?
Well, I think you can have two answers to that question. I think that it's absolutely fair to make those comments in terms of the Liberal platform. It is obviously a hot point politically, and there's an attempt to obviously capitalize on that. But in terms of sort of the reaction and what's going on, I think that it's important to recognize that, yes, Andrew Scheer quickly came out and vehemently denied that he would reopen the debate. But we have to also understand that this is a divisive issue within the Conservative Party more broadly, which is, as I mentioned earlier, increasingly has active support by pro-life groups anti-abortion groups that are coordinating with groups in the United States. So I want to make one point is that in 2014, Stephen Harper's government decided that they would not reopen the debate, which was sort of reading the public climate at the time. And 4 years later, 2018, they did, for the very first time at their convention, vote on it. And it was defeated, but by a tiny, narrow margin. It was something like 57 to 43 in the votes. So I think that it is a divisive issue with the Conservative Party, and we are seeing the influence of pro-life, activists. So I don't think Scheer is saying he's not going to reopen it, but he's certainly not letting others within the party talk about it and advocate and affiliate themselves with these groups.
The only thing I would say is that not everyone who has misgivings about the legal status quo in Canada is an activist. They're just Canadians, and they're participating in the political process. I don't know what the alternative would be. Would we preclude anyone who expresses anything but full affirmation for the status quo be precluded from participating in our politics. That happens to be the position of the Prime Minister these days. He's precluded anyone who has misgivings with the status quo from being a Liberal candidate. The Liberal members in the House blocked a Conservative MP, Rachel Harder, from being a parliamentary committee chair because of her views on these issues. And of course, last year we had a major controversy in Canada around the Canada Summer Jobs Program. It seems to me it's important that these issues be openly debated. And I don't see anything wrong or to think that people who have, as I said earlier, misgivings with the fact that we've not had a debate since the Morgentaler decision. These people, I think, are family members, our neighbors, people in our community, and I see no harm, and in fact, quite the opposite, to give them a chance to express those views and participate in our politics.
Now, we are very quickly running out of time, but I saw both Brittany and Anne open up their mouths ready to respond to this. So, Brittany and Anne, I want to give you just a final quick last word, and that will be it then. So, Brittany, go ahead. I know you wanted to respond.
Absolutely. I think when Anne is referring to those who are activists, she's referring to those who are actively trying to take away a woman's right to choose. So these are people who are protesting, these are people who are at rallies, these are people who are knocking on doors, standing at corners, etc. So that's a very specific contingent of folks. There are many people who hold pro-life views, but they're not out there on the streets, and they're not out there, I would say at times, harassing people or stopping people or in front of abortion clinics, etc. Right? So this does pose as a threat. And I really need to take this back in terms of making abortions illegal does not stop abortions from happening. So it's a matter of access to good health care. It's a matter of how do we ensure that we diminish or lower the risk of women who do choose this procedure? How do we ensure that women in general have good access to health care? That is the bottom line of this issue. And for sure, we can have a debate about this all day, but I think it's really important right now to acknowledge that these are rights that are debating. We are debating people's rights to exist, I think in an equitable and free way in this country. And I think those debates are a very slippery slope to have.
Anne, final word.
The point I was going to make is that in many ways, Justin Trudeau is regarded within these groups as almost their favorite politician because because of the fact that he is, sort of a very hard line in terms of, keeping the status quo, etc. So it becomes a debate about freedom of expression, which is one of the wedge issues that is being used to drive this conversation. It isn't actually a debate. I think that we have to understand that Stephen Harper, back in 2014, opinions change, but he read the national mood, and I think that it still prevails. We see, yes, people have, sort of feelings about the abortion status quo, but at this point in time, most Canadians are on board with it and don't see it as a debate and don't think it needs to be reopened and are concerned about the kind of modeling that we're seeing in the United States right now.